Hello, this is Adam House, and now this is week 8 of Resisting Fascism in Global History, my undergraduate student diary of the class that I'm taking in Resisting Fascism in Global History. This week we are talking about another book. Book that we read for class this time is called Outwitting the Gestapo by Lucie Aubrac. This book is copyright 1993 by University of Nebraska Press. There's also a movie that was made somewhere around 4 years later. I believe it was called, maybe just by her name, Lucie Aubrac. I have not watched the movie yet. I've only read this book for class. So, this book is about Lucie Aubrac and the French resistance during World War II. Before I get into it, I just want to mention that it's been 2 weeks since my last video because last week we had fall break and we did not have our usually weekly class in Resisting Fascism in Global History. Again, it's a once a week class that meets for 3 hours once a week, and it fell during the fall break, so that's the reason we didn't have one last week. Anyway, so now we're week 8 of Resisting Fascism in Global History, talking about this book that we read, Outwitting the Gestapo, about Lucie Aubrac and the French resistance during World War II. Interesting things about this book. For one, it's a pretty good story all the way through. The book was written several years after the actual events, even though it's written in diary style, in journal style. It is not a journal that was kept during the resistance, but written from memory after. So, as with most historical documents that come in the form of a diary, it, I believe, has quite a bit of historical value, but should also be understood to be taken with a bit of a grain of salt. There's, conversations that are recounted in the book that I'm sure are not verbatim quotes, events that happen in the book that may be a little bit off on date or, specifics about the event. So if you just keep those kinds of things in mind as you read, I think it, again, still has quite a bit of historical value, even though you have to understand that it's coming from somebody's memory many years after the fact. So this is a book that I can definitely recommend. I think it's well worth your time. Lucie Aubrac was a high-ranking member, and her husband also was a high-ranking member, and they were over large regions of the French resistance during World War II. They were quite prolific in their resistance. They were involved in activities and everything from intelligence gathering to acting as moles inside centers of power of the Nazi occupation in France. They were instrumental in not only spying but also passing sensitive information and communications between resistance networks and among resistance networks and in France and other places. They stockpiled weapons. They had to very quietly and very carefully accrue these weapons to stockpile. They hid other people, such as Jewish people who were trying to hide from the Nazis during World War II, and other people who were targets of the Third Reich. They were active in creating or finding safe houses and creating safe houses where people who were hiding from the Third Reich could be kept and kept safe from the Nazi regime. They also engaged in a lot of clandestine activities. They also engaged in direct combat. They wielded their weapons in direct combat with the Nazis. Lucie Aubrac herself was part of missions where her life was on the line, under fire, and she had her own weapon and returned fire. She was no withering flower or wilting flower, as it were. So again, I highly recommend the book. There's a few things that I want to say about the book in particular. I want to talk about Lucie's her value as a resistor. I'm just going to read. This is not very long. It's just it's a one paragraph. One of the paragraphs that I had to write about the value of Lucie Aubrac's resistance to fascism. And the question being basically, what is the value, or what was the value of her resistance to fascism? And here's what I wrote. In general, I have to believe that Lucie's resistance to fascism was largely invaluable. She was not only a resistor who played her own small part, but was rather a prolific clandestine operator. Even by today's professional standards, Lucie would have to be considered a top asset for any agency or government. The sheer diversity and volume of her resistance activities alone would serve even the most elite clandestine services community very well. However, Lucie also possesses a certain it factor, in that her sex creates a particular inherent camouflage that can disarm some would-be suspicious men prone to underestimating the proficiencies of women. Throw in the passions of motherly instinct and love of a significant other, her husband, and Lucie is someone anybody should hope to never have as an enemy. Intelligence gathering, passing sensitive information, procuring important weapons supplies, serving as a mole in the enemy's strongholds, and carrying out deadly military raids, Lucie's contribution to resisting fascism is as heroic as it is prolific and would be difficult to overstate. So that's what I had to say about Lucie's contributions to resisting fascism. Now, another thing I want to talk about quickly here, though, is Lucie's motivation. And, we can talk about what are the motivations for any given person who chooses to engage in acts of resistance to fascism. Lucie's motives for resisting fascism are rather self-evident. It was her concrete experiences that thrust her into that position. Her country was invaded by an occupying fascist military force, and so this made her need to resist fascism immediately as someone with a family. And on page 67 of her book, she says, "A huge shudder runs from the back of my head to my heels. A wave swells and twists in my stomach. Suddenly, I see my marvelous child, my 28-month-old baby, forgetting his name, forgetting his parents, being raised in an ice-cold universe, learning to respect only force and to value, as their national anthem proclaims, Deutschland über alles." Talking about the future that she worried would be the destiny of her child if her child were to be raised in the shadow of the Third Reich. So her motivation was very visceral. It was very intimate. It was about her own family. Her homeland being occupied by this fascist military meant that this was not a resistance of choice so much for her, but as a mother, as a wife, as a native French citizen, she very much was thrust into this role but she also, that's not to take anything away, not to minimize her role in any way or her motives for her role in any way, because she very much embraced that role, and she lived out that role to the fullest. I can say I think it's safe to say that she very much poured herself, her heart, mind, body, and soul, and every ounce of her being into the resistance. So, when we think about this, what greater motivator could there be? We think about the motivations for people who resist fascism, or maybe who join a military of any kind, that maybe, there's feelings of patriotism where it comes out of kind of a nationalistic fervor, or, then there's also those people who are just looking for something honorable to do, or some people just looking for a paycheck, or for military benefits, education benefits, health benefits, things like that. Of course, joining the French resistance didn't come with education and health benefits. This, again, the motivator here was not so much what she was going to get back out of it, but what she was going to save herself and her family and her country from. So, again, a very intimate and kind of personal motivation for being part of the resistance. But I think it does kind of highlight the point that fascism is going to affect you. If fascism is allowed to continue, when it takes off in a country, if it's allowed to continue to grow and to metastasize, it's going to affect you in a lot of different ways, and it's probably not only going to affect you, it's going to affect your loved ones, it's going to affect the people that you care about. And so in that is just a good lesson in why it is so important to resist rising fascism, because if we don't nip it in the bud before it gets out of hand, it can devastate the lives of everybody that we love. All of our friends, family, acquaintances, anything and anybody that we care about can be destroyed by fascism. So again, just highlighting the need to resist fascism in all of its forms, in all of its manifestations, and as early and as soon as possible before it can get to that point. So now another kind of interesting thing that happened here is I'm also simultaneously taking a class in 20th century European history, and it just so happened that at the same time that I was reading Outwitting the Gestapo for my Resisting Fascism and Global History class, I was also reading a book called Under a Cruel Star by Heda Margolius Kovaly in my 20th century European history class. These books were very similar. In fact, Lucie's husband's name is Raymond, and Heda's husband's name is Rudolph. and they were very similar books about very similar women who were her kind of prolific resistors in their own right. Now, I'm going to talk about this one for a second. It's from a different class, but what was interesting, one of the things that was interesting about Under a Cruel Star is that Heda, she actually lived in Czechoslovakia during World War II, and she was taken prisoner and put into Auschwitz. So she was a survivor of the Nazi concentration camps. And after she survives that ordeal in the concentration camps, she gets, after the liberation, after the Third Reich is destroyed, for a very short amount of time, her and her husband get to experience a little bit of freedom, but then very quickly they fall under the Iron Curtain. So as the Soviet bloc continues to exert its authority and its influence over the Eastern European countries, Czechoslovakia is one of those countries that falls behind the Iron Curtain. Heda's husband becomes a high-ranking official within the Communist Party and within the Communist government in Czechoslovakia. He becomes a minister in charge of trade relations. And Heda is basically, a helpmate to him. I don't want to, there's definitely places in the book where she's apprehensive about her husband's work, where she's worried about him and things like this. But she also tries to be a supportive wife. She tries to do what she can to support her husband in what he does. And, one of the reasons that her and her husband become active in the Communist Party, and she admits later on that it was a mistake, but she says that that they had, during their time under Nazi rule, had come to believe that that the Soviets were basically the opposite of the Nazis, and therefore the Soviets would not do all of the deplorable, inhumane, authoritarian, tyrannical, despotic things like the Nazis did. And so they believed that going basically the other direction meant that they could escape from all the worst horrors of authoritarianism that they experienced under the Nazis. So this is one of the reasons that they so passionately get involved in the Communist Party. And of course, as Joseph Stalin's authoritarianism manifests in its own way, they begin to feel, Heda and her husband begin to feel the rule of that iron fist, and they begin to feel the weight of the Soviet authoritarianism as well. One of the reasons that I wanted to mention this other book, and let's see, Under a Cruel Star is published in 1986 by Plunkett Lake Press, Cambridge, Massachusetts. I want to read just a couple of lines here that Heda writes about the experiences that they had under Nazi rule, and then how that had an effect later on, how that affected the way that things played out then under Soviet rule later. She says, "By the end of our time in the camps, many prisoners came to accept the view that freedom is something that has to be earned and fought for, a privilege that is awarded like a medal. It is hardly possible for people to live so many years as slaves in everyday contact with fascists and fascism without becoming somewhat twisted, without contracting a trace of that dry rot unwittingly and unwillingly." I thought that was pretty perceptive and pretty powerful. We're influenced by our environments. Like it or not, we are creatures that are connected to the world around us. And the atmosphere that we're in has an influence on us. And she was very apt to perceive that her time in the camps, and not just her, but all of her fellow Czechs and other people that had been held in the Nazi camps, were affected by that in ways that a lot of them didn't even understand, didn't even realize. And that the seeds of what came later had been planted. Some of the seeds of the Soviet authoritarianism that they experienced later had been planted during their time under Nazi rule. So it just goes to show that that again, either left or right, the authoritarianism can be a force for oppression in such a way that that is just absolutely soul shattering, soul crushing. And I don't want to get too far into this other book, either book, but I just wanted to point out, and this one I have to say honestly, if you're going to read either one of these books, I recommend both. But this is an outstanding read. This book, it's highly readable. It's such heavy, dark material. I don't want to say that it's an enjoyable read. That feels like a wrong way to say that. But I will say that this is a very rewarding read, and it's a highly readable book, and you will not regret it. It's not even that long. It's 194 pages, and look at this. It's not like it's not too dense. It's not too difficult to get through. It uses fairly basic language, or at a level that's very easy to understand. So that's it. So the last comment that I want to make about this material from week 8 of Resisting Fascism in Global History is to talk just a little bit about the dynamic of women in resistance. And I don't want to say that it should be treated as a separate subject, because we don't want to separate the women and say that this is a different thing, because women are inherently part of the resistance as well. So you don't want to give them just a special one-off day and say, or a one-off lesson per se, and say, oh, well, this is the one day we're just dedicating to the women, and the rest of the time it's not about them. Okay, women are always present. The feminine part of resistance is always present as well. But this is just to highlight the fact that that women did resist, that women were involved in resisting fascism, and honestly, I don't know how we successfully would have won in World War II without the contributions of women. Whether you're talking about somebody like Lucie Aubrac, who was on the front lines, acting in every way and shape and possible way that a man could act in resisting, all the way down to carrying a gun into combat, shooting at Nazis and getting shot at by Nazis. And all of the risk that she took, all of the dedication that she had, dedicating her whole life to resisting fascism. It's there's a lot to be said for the fact that women made those kinds of contributions, but they were also making contributions even back here in the United States. While a lot of the men in America were over in Europe and in the Pacific theater fighting World War II, a lot of the women had moved into the factories, into industry, and they were building the tanks, they were building the airplanes, they were putting together the munitions to send to the men. They were raising victory gardens, and they were raising money, selling war bonds and things. They were an active part of the resistance, without whom we would not have been able to probably win the war. Certainly things would not have played out the way that they did without the contributions of women. So that's just to say that that we should not minimize or discount the contributions of women in resistance, and that if you are a woman and you participate in resistance, or want to participate in resistance, you should know that there's a rich history there, that you're in good company, and that your contribution is just as valuable as a man's. And so I want everybody to understand that we're all a part, if and when we decide to engage in resistance to fascism. We're all a part of it, and we all have roles to play, and all of us are important, in that movement, in those efforts. So that's it for week 8, Resisting Fascism in Global History. I'll see you next week. As always, remember, fuck Trump, fuck ICE.